All right, guys, check these out. So this is your factory Highlifter shock. This is the shock off of a normal, like Sportsman 850, 1000. Same exact extended length, full length, right? But much shorter compressed length because there's a lot more shiny shaft. So I'm gonna try to show you the differences between these two shocks. I think this shock is a pretty serious upgrade for the Highlifter edition because it gives you a lot more up travel. So if you look at it right now, this Highlifter rear shock has about, let's say 2 1/4, it's really not even 2 1/4. It has about 2 1/4 inches, maybe 2 1/8 inches of compression before you start hitting the bump stop. This shock right here off of a base model has about 4 3/4 inches before it hits the bump stop. So this shock has literally more than twice as much usable travel as this shock. That's pretty insane. I was able to get a full set of these shocks, front and rear. Bushings are in great shape. They're very clean for $240 shipped on eBay. And I think it is an excellent performance upgrade. Now, the obvious question is, yes, you're getting more travel, but what about the spring rates? So if we look at this right here, you can see that this blue spring is a little bit shorter than the black spring. That's because, you know, difference in preload, difference in travel. So if you wanted to run this blue spring on your black shock to keep your nice blue spring and the Highlifter spring rate, you would need to run a small spring spacer. I like to do PVC spacers, stuff like that, but however you want to do it, you need to run some kind of spring spacer if you're going to put this shock over here, or you could just max out this adjustment and that'd probably get you pretty close. But you probably want more preload than that just to maintain maximum ground clearance. Also, this black spring is a little bigger. The coil itself, like the exterior diameter, it's pretty big. Looking at 3.6 inches versus, sorry guys, trying to do this with one hand, versus 3.1 inches roughly. So you do have a bigger diameter here, so this could have problems rubbing stuff. I ran them on my Sportsman, no issue. The thing we really want to measure though is the diameter of the coil, because that gives you a pretty good indication of the stiffness of the spring, so the spring rate. All right, so this coil is 9.66 millimeters, and this coil is 9.74 millimeters. So the blue coils are a little bit smaller in exterior diameter, but they are a little bit thicker. Yes, that could be the powder coat, but I doubt it. I bet the Highlifter has a little stiffer spring rate because it's a mud bike that's kind of trying to have more ground clearance when it's covered in mud. So what I would recommend doing is swapping this spring to here. I'm gonna leave the blue shocks on for now because warranty. Once your warranty's out, obviously you wanna swap it. But what I am gonna do is I'm gonna take apart your new shock, take the spring off and install it on the machine and cycle the suspension. So that's a great way to look for tire rubbing, right? Just remove the spring. All right, so I disassembled the new shock, which is the one off of the non-Highlifter. Look at how much glorious up travel we have. And I took the spring off and installed it. Now we're gonna jack up the tire all the way up, and we're gonna see how much rubbing we're gonna have with this long travel shock setup. Okay, so you can see we've got some rubbing right here, and right here. It's worth noting that this is the worst case scenario because the bracket lift, when you install the bracket lift, that's gonna help here a little bit. All right, and how close are we to the bump stop? So we're not quite hitting the bump stop yet, and we do have some substantial rubbing. Is it rubbing anywhere else in the fender though? No, it's just rubbing plastics right now. So you could pretty easily trim this right here. What I did on mine was I put those raked arms, because you can see if you were to bring the tire back a little bit, that would alleviate a lot of this rubbing. Is it rubbing on this inside? It's not rubbing in here yet, but it will eventually. Once I did the lift kit though, let's keep going up. All right, so now it's stuffed in there really good. Oh, that looks fucking cool. Looks like my Lexus. We are on the bump stop right there. That's good. And let's see if we have rubbing on the front of the tire. Really just barely have rubbing up here. Most of the rubbing is out here. And once you do wheel spacers, that'd be your only rubbing. So to run these, flip that back down. That'll look cool. So to run these Sportsman shocks in the rear, the non-Highlifter shocks, I'm going to call them, you need to do the bracket lift and potentially do a little bit of trimming. And when you do the bracket lift, by the way, 2 things to watch out for. You're going to have to add a wheel spacer because the tire is going to get close to the snorkel, and this upper control arm is going to get close to the CV boot. On a 2024, 2023 like this, you don't need to cut out the control arm up here like the directions say, unless you're running a bigger aftermarket axle. So if you ever go to a bigger axle, make sure you have enough clearance between the CV boot and this arm at full down travel. Alrighty, here's the front shock comparison. This is the Highlifter, the blue, obviously. This is the base model. Way thicker springs on the front. I'll measure them in a second. And interestingly enough, the blue spring is actually longer than the black spring now. And it's actually kind of, it's actually longer than it looks because this is set on the highest preload, this is on the lowest. I probably should have set them to apples to apples. But anyway, if you wanted to put this spring onto this shock, definitely leave it at the lowest preload setting, and it's gonna be a stiff ride. I tell you what, it's gonna have a lot of preload, which means your front end's gonna stay maxed out most of the time. So I'm not sure if it'd be a good idea to put this spring over here. If you want more height in the front, the way to go would probably be to use this spring with a small spring spacer. That's what I would do, and then maybe get this spring powder coated to match. You could maybe cut the spring, like cut a little bit of the coil off here. You could do something like that to run this spring over here. But you know, it's gonna sit a little wonky, but we can experiment with that later once you're out of warranty. So the numbers, let's set this. So this coil is about 10.84 in diameter, and this coil is 9.45. So pretty big difference in coil diameter. But again, same exact extended length. Now here's the part we're after, is the extra travel. So if you look at this, you got about 2¼ inches before you contact the bump stop. And over here, you got about 3¼ inches before you contact the bump stop. So it's not as much of a gain in the front for suspension travel, and that makes sense. That goes that again goes with the spec sheet. I mean, it's still 50% more travel, but it's not double the travel like in the rear. And that makes sense if you look at the Highlifter spec sheets and stuff like that. I still think it's a big improvement to have that extra up travel for the ride quality and the extra wheel articulation, right? So if you have more up travel, you can articulate more, and that actually gets you more traction. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna pull the blue spring or the black spring off, throw the shock on there like we did last time, and see how close we get to the plastics at the bump stop. All right, so repeating the same activity up front, we got no spring on the shock. This is the, not the Highlifter shock, this is the regular Sportsman shock. The front's a little more complicated, obviously, because you have steering to consider. So let's see what's what up front. So up front, we're already contacting the bump stop, and we're not rubbing the plastic up here, right? So the front fits a little easier, and that's because the front wasn't as big of a difference between the Highlifter shock and the regular Sportsman shock. It looks pretty sweet though, all flexed out. And of course, you're gonna add the bracket lift, probably flip it, right? So that's gonna improve the clearance there as well. Now let's steer the wheel and see where we start to get into trouble. The steering is severely limited, so it might be okay, it looks like. Yeah, we're clearing all the snorkels too. So let's look down here. I think we're pretty good. So obviously it's gonna go up a little bit more once you compress the bump stop, but the front is pretty much a direct swap. You don't need to do anything too fancy up here to run these shocks. Now, if you're gonna run bigger tires, obviously you gotta have some considerations for that. You gotta think about the headlight. So if we turn all the way this way, we're clearing the snorkel. we turn all the way the other way, let's see if we get into the headlight. We're actually clearing the headlight and everything. So I would zip tie the wires up a little bit, keep the wire away from the tire. But yeah, you've got enough clearance even without the bracket lift up front. Now, I know you're planning on doing West Virginia and stuff like that, so depending on the tire size you're going to run, you might not have that many rubbing issues on the rear. These tires are like a true 30, maybe a 30 and a half. So yeah, hopefully that is some useful information for everybody if you're looking at improving the shockage on your Sportsman. I think it's very well worth the $200-300 it costs to get a set of OEM non-Highlifter shocks. It completely night and day difference on my Sportsman.